I've always believed the badge was a shield, not just against bullets or danger, but against the dirt that clings to people who don't live by rules. Growing up, I watched my father's fists pound our kitchen table, rage pouring out of him like a broken dam whenever he saw the news. Someone cheating the system, someone talking. I became a cop because of him, because I wanted to prove that someone somewhere could K. By 34, I'd built a career that made me proud, though it came at a cost. The long hours, the missed birthdays, the calls in the middle of the night. It took years to learn how to shoulder that weight without breaking. But the world doesn't stop testing you, does it? No matter how steady you think you've become, there's always something around the corner. For me, that something had a name. Victor Reyes. But before him there was Daniel. Perfect, unflinching, dependable Daniel. He was the kind of man who made you believe good people still existed. A businessman who didn't just talk about charity but made it happen. He funded an orphanage on the city's south side, visited regularly, and spoke to the kids like they mattered. He told me once it was because of his parents. They were killed in a robbery when he was 15, and the only thing that got him through the darkest days was knowing they'd been kind, decent people. His philanthropy was his way of keeping their memory alive. When Daniel proposed, I said yes without hesitation. The idea of building a life with him felt like redemption for the chaos my job often dragged me into. But the truth? Deep down, I never believed I deserved someone like him. A man without shadows. That's what made the affair all the more unforgivable. The day Victor Reyes walked into the precinct, I felt the shift before I even knew his name. He was assigned to my team, another detective to share the impossible caseload of the homicide unit. He was tall, with dark eyes that saw too much and a quiet intensity that made the room seem smaller when he was in it. He shook my hand firmly, his grip steady but not crushing, and met my gaze with an unsettling calm. "Detective Reyes," he said. His voice was deep, steady, and carried no warmth. "Detective Jameson," I replied, letting go of his hand. His skin was rough, like someone who'd lived a harder life than he wanted to admit. "Welcome to the circus." His mouth twitched, almost a smile but not quite. "I've worked a few circuses. This one doesn't look much different." Started as respect. Victor was damn good at his job. Methodical, relentless, the kind of cop who saw patterns everyone else missed. But he wasn't easy to know. He didn't join in the locker room jokes or hang out for drinks after a case. He was always the last one to leave his desk, his head bent over reports or photos, his fingers tapping out rhythms on his pen when he thought no one was watching. When I tried to crack his shell, he deflected with skillful precision. "Where'd you transfer from?" I asked one night as we worked through paperwork after a grueling day. "New York," he said without looking up. "You miss it?" He shrugged. "I don't think about it. Family there." His hand froze mid-tap, just for a second, before he set the pen down and met my eyes. No, it wasn't what he said that stopped me from pressing further. It was the wall I saw behind his eyes, the kind that doesn't come down without a fight. I recognized it because I'd built walls like that myself. Months passed. We worked side by side, tackling some of the ugliest cases I'd ever seen. One night, we chased a suspect into an abandoned factory. I'll never forget the way Victor moved. Calculated, efficient, his gun steady even when the floor creaked ominously beneath our boots. When we cornered the guy, Victor didn't flinch as the man lunged at him with a rusted pipe. One clean shot and it was over. Later, back at the precinct, I found him in the locker room, staring at his hands as water ran over them in the sink. His knuckles were bruised, probably from when he'd disarmed the suspect after the shot. I leaned against the doorway, unsure if I should interrupt. "You good?" I asked finally. He looked up, his reflection catching my eyes in the mirror. "It doesn't get easier." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I felt it too, the weight of every life we took, every choice we couldn't undo. "No," I said quietly. "It doesn't." For the first time, he let me see past the wall. "I don't think it's supposed to." That was the moment the thread between us was tied. Neither of us realized it then, but the knot had already begun to form. At home, Daniel noticed I was quieter than usual. One night, as we sat on the couch, he reached for my hand. "Talk to me, Laura," he said softly. His brown eyes, warm and steady, were filled with concern. "There's nothing to talk about," I lied, squeezing his hand. "Work's just heavy right now." He nodded, accepting the explanation without question. That's who Daniel was, trusting, understanding. And it made me feel like the worst person in the world. The first time I kissed Victor was after a case that gutted us both. A man had killed his wife and child in a drunken rage before turning the gun on himself. We'd walked into that house together, seen the blood splattered across the pale yellow walls, the toys still scattered on the living room floor. We worked late that night, neither of us willing to go home and sit with the silence. Around midnight, Victor stood, stretching his arms over his head. "You should go," he said. "Daniel's probably waiting." I don't know why I said it, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. "He's used to waiting." Victor's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he looked at me. "That doesn't sound like the kind of man you deserve." The laugh that escaped me was bitter and sharp. "Maybe I don't deserve him." Victor didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me, it wasn't pity. It was understanding. And that's when it happened. One moment we were standing inches apart, the air thick between us. The next, his lips were on mine, and I was kissing him back, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. When we pulled apart, reality crashed down around me. "This can't happen," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he said. But neither of us moved. The kiss was a line crossed, an unspoken promise broken. The kind of thing that changes everything, even if no one speaks of it again. We didn't talk about it. Not in the days that followed, not during our shared cases, not even when our eyes met across the precinct, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. But silence doesn't erase the truth. It only lets it grow in the cracks. Daniel was waiting for me when I got home that night. He was wearing one of his soft, worn sweaters, the kind I loved leaning into on cold evenings. A book was in his lap, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. "You're late," he said gently, no accusation in his tone. I dropped my bag by the door and tried to summon a smile. "Long day. Bad case." "Yeah." The lie came easier than it should have. "One of the worst." He set the book down and stood, crossing the room in a few easy strides. His arms wrapped around me solid and safe, pulling me into his warmth. "I'm sorry," he murmured into my hair. "I wish I could take all that weight off your shoulders." The guilt hit me like a punch to the stomach. I clung to him tighter, my eyes squeezing shut as if that could stop the ache inside me. "I'm okay," I whispered, my voice hollow. But I wasn't okay. Not even close. The next time Victor and I were alone, it was in the dimly lit interrogation room at the precinct. We were working a high-profile case, trying to pin down a suspect with too many alibis and not enough remorse. Victor paced the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his frustration palpable. "He's lying," Victor muttered, his voice low and sharp. "I can feel it." I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him. "Yeah, well, feeling it isn't enough. We need proof." Victor stopped pacing and turned to face me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "And what if proof isn't enough, Laura? What if the system fails him like it always does?" "Then we keep fighting," I said firmly. "We don't get to rewrite the rules just because they don't always work." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. "You really believe that? Even after everything we've seen?" "I have to," I said softly. "Because if I don't, what's the point?" Something flickered in his expression, respect maybe, or something deeper. He nodded, his anger simmering but contained. "You're a better person than me," he said quietly. I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that I was just as flawed and broken as anyone else, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I looked away, pretending to study the file in my hands. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until Victor broke it. "About the other night," he began, his voice careful. My pulse quickened, but I kept my gaze on the file. "What about it?" "We can't." He paused, searching for the right words. "We can't let it happen again." I nodded, my throat tight. "I know. But knowing and doing are two very different things." At home, Daniel was planning a charity gala for the orphanage. It was the kind of event he thrived on: black tie, champagne, the city's elite mingling for a good cause. He asked me to help him pick a suit, holding up two options with a boyish grin that made my heart ache. "The navy one," I said, forcing a smile. "It brings out your eyes." He leaned in, brushing a kiss against my temple. "What would I do without you?" I couldn't answer. The guilt was eating me alive, A constant knot in my stomach that tightened every time he smiled at me. Every time he touched me with the kind of tenderness I no longer deserved. That night, as we lay in bed, Daniel traced lazy patterns on my arm, his voice soft in the dark. "I've been thinking about the wedding," he said. "Maybe we should start planning. Pick a date." I turned my head to look at him, my chest tightening. "You sure? I thought you wanted to wait." "I did," he admitted. "But the truth is, I don't want to wait anymore. I want to marry you, Laura. I want to build a life with you." The sincerity in his voice nearly broke me. I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his, and forced a smile. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." But as Daniel drifted off to sleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me like a stone. Victor's presence became an inevitability. No matter how much I tried to avoid him, our cases kept us tethered together. And with every long night, every unspoken glance, the distance I tried to create only grew smaller. One night, after wrapping up a case that had drained us both, we found ourselves outside the precinct, the cold air biting at our skin. Victor lit a cigarette, the ember glowing faintly in the darkness. "I thought you didn't smoke," I said, my breath visible in the frigid air. "Only when I can't sleep," he replied, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Which is most nights." I hesitated, then leaned against the wall beside him. "Why do you do this? The job, I mean. Why not walk away and start fresh?" He laughed, a low bitter sound. "Fresh? There's no such thing for people like me." "People like you?" I echoed, frowning. "People who can't outrun their past," he said simply. "No matter how far they go." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that everyone deserves a clean slate, but the words felt hollow. I didn't believe them any more than he did. When he turned to look at me, his expression was unreadable. "You should go home, Laura," he said softly. "Daniel's probably waiting." The mention of Daniel's name was like a slap, a jarring reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. I nodded, pushing off the wall. "Yeah. Good night, Victor." But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving part of myself behind. It's amazing how guilt changes the way you see the world. Every corner I turned felt like someone might be watching, even though I knew no one was. Every word Daniel said felt heavier, laced with meaning he didn't intend. He'd smile at me over breakfast, his eyes warm with love, and I'd feel like I was suffocating. I became a stranger in my own home. The place that once felt safe now felt like a cage. Every laugh, every shared joke with Daniel felt like a betrayal. I told myself I'd end it with Victor, that it had been a moment of weakness, nothing more. But every time I looked at him, I knew I was lying. A week after the case wrapped, Daniel invited me to visit the orphanage with him. It wasn't unusual. He liked to show me where his money went, the kids who benefited from it. But this time the invitation came with a hint of urgency. "You've been distant lately," he said, standing in the kitchen as I poured myself a cup of coffee. His tone was gentle, but there was an edge to it. I thought maybe seeing the orphanage again would help. "Ground you." I froze, my hands gripping the mug tightly. "I'm fine, Daniel. It's just work. You always say that." He stepped closer, his hand brushing my arm. "Come with me. Just for a little while. Let me remind you why we do what we do." I nodded because there was no good reason to say no. The orphanage was the same as always, modest but well kept, the staff cheerful, the kids bright-eyed despite their circumstances. Daniel walked through the halls with an ease that made him seem like he belonged there, stopping to greet staff by name and crouching down to talk to the children at their level. Watching him, I was reminded of why I fell in love with him in the first place. He was good. The kind of good you don't see much anymore. But even in that moment, my thoughts betrayed me. I caught myself wondering what Victor would think of this place, of Daniel's generosity. I wondered if it would soften the sharp edges of his pain, or if it would only make them worse. "Miss Laura." A voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see a boy no older than 7 running toward me. His face lit up with a toothy grin. I knelt down, smiling as he threw his arms around my neck. "Hey Max. How's it going?" "Good," he said, pulling back just enough to look at me. "Mr. Calloway said you might come visit. Are you staying for dinner?" Before I could answer, Daniel appeared beside us, his hand ruffling Max's hair. "She might not be able to this time, buddy. Detective Jameson's very busy." The way Daniel said it, Detective Jameson, sent a chill down my spine. It was a reminder of who I was, of the life I'd chosen, of the distance that was growing between us. That night, Daniel brought up the wedding again. He was excited, his voice brimming with ideas for venues and dates. But all I could think about was Victor. His voice, his touch, the way he made me feel like I wasn't carrying the world alone. Laura. Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. He was watching me, his brow furrowed. Are you even listening? I forced a smile, reaching across the table to take his hand. I'm sorry. Long day. His frown deepened. It's more than that. You've been somewhere else lately. Talk to me. I'm fine, Daniel, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. It's just work. You know how it is. He pulled his hand back, his jaw tightening. No, Laura. I don't know how it is. Because you don't let me in anymore. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What could I say? That he was right? That I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us anymore? A few nights later, I found myself alone with Victor again. We'd finished a grueling interrogation, and the precinct was quiet, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound. Victor leaned back in his chair, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened. He looked tired, but there was a calmness about him that drew me in. You should go home, he said, not looking at me. Daniel's waiting. Don't tell me what to do, I snapped, surprising even myself with the sharpness of my tone. Victor raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. Touchy. I'm not in the mood for this, I muttered, gathering my things. You're never in the mood for anything, are you? He said, his voice low but cutting. Not when it matters. I froze, turning to glare at him. What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means you're running, he said, standing and closing the distance between us. From him, from me, from yourself. And the worst part? You don't even see it. I opened my mouth to argue, but his words hit too close to the truth. You don't know me, I said, finally, my voice trembling. His gaze softened just a fraction. Don't I? I hated him for that. For the way he looked at me like he saw everything I tried to hide. And I hated myself even more for not walking away. Instead, I let him kiss me again. That night, I went home and climbed into bed beside Daniel, my skin still buzzing from Victor's touch. As I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, Daniel shifted in his sleep, his arm draping over my waist. It should have been comforting. It should have felt like home. But all I felt was the weight of the lies piling up between us. The lie became my constant companion, a thread that wove itself into every part of my life. I wore it like a second skin, so tightly wrapped around me that I started to believe I could keep it hidden forever. But lies have a way of bleeding into the truth, don't they? Of seeping into the cracks and turning everything dark. Daniel, ever patient, continued to plan our future. He was oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, or maybe he was just choosing not to see it. He spent his evenings buried in gala details, coordinating donations and guest lists. He'd ask for my opinion on the menu, the decor, and I'd nod along, barely hearing him. Every time I looked at him, guilt clawed at my chest. It didn't help that Victor was everywhere. Every case, every briefing, every stolen glance across the precinct. He was a magnet, pulling me in no matter how hard I tried to resist. The gala was scheduled for the following Friday, a black tie event in one of the city's most exclusive venues. Daniel was in his element, charming donors and schmoozing politicians. I stood by his side, a glass of champagne in my hand, forcing smiles and polite conversation. But all I could think about was Victor. I hadn't seen him since our last kiss. I'd been avoiding him, taking on desk work and finding excuses to leave the precinct early. But the distance hadn't helped. If anything, it made things worse. His voice, his touch, the way he looked at me, it haunted me. Laura. Daniel's voice pulled me back to the present. He was looking at me with concern, his hand warm against the small of my back. You've been quiet all night. Are you okay? I nodded, forcing a smile. Just tired. Long week. He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing, but before he could press further, one of the donors approached him with a question. I seized the opportunity to slip away, weaving through the crowd until I found an empty balcony. The cool night air was a relief, a stark contrast to the warmth and noise of the ballroom. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights, trying to quiet the storm inside me. "You're not much for parties, are you?" The voice sent a jolt through me. I turned and there he was. Victor, leaning casually against the doorway, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't dressed for the event. His tie was loose, his shirt slightly wrinkled, but he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that always unnerved me. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Security detail," he said, smirking. "Apparently, the city's elite need babysitters." I rolled my eyes, turning back to the view. "Shouldn't you be inside, keeping an eye on things?" "I am," he said, stepping closer. "You're part of things, aren't you?" His words sent a chill down my spine. I turned to face him, my chest tight. "Victor, don't what?" he asked, his voice low. "Don't look at you? Don't talk to you? Don't remind you of the thing you can't stop thinking about?" I shook my head, my hands gripping the railing. "This has to stop." He took another step closer, his dark eyes locked on mine. "Does it?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "Because if it doesn't, I'm going to lose everything." He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Maybe you already have." I left the balcony without another word, my heart pounding. Daniel was waiting for me inside, his face lighting up when he saw me. He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me, pulling me back to the life I was trying so desperately to hold on to. But that night, as we drove home, the silence between us was suffocating. Daniel's hand rested on my thigh, a gesture that used to make me feel safe, but now it felt like a weight I couldn't bear. "You seem distracted tonight," he said finally, his voice quiet. I swallowed hard, staring out the window. "I told you it's just work." "Is it?" he asked, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place, doubt maybe or fear. I turned to look at him, forcing a smile. "Of course. What else would it be?" He didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he focused on the road ahead. The tension in the car was palpable, a reminder that the lies I'd built my world on were starting to crack. The following week, Victor and I were assigned to a robbery case. It was supposed to be straightforward: track the stolen goods, pin down the suspects, but nothing in our line of work ever stayed simple for long. We spent hours combing through evidence, our usual rhythm returning despite the chaos between us. It felt almost normal, like the way things used to be. But normal didn't last. As we wrapped up for the day, Victor stopped me in the hallway, his hand brushing mine. "Laura," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Bullshit," he said, stepping in front of me. "You can't keep running from this." "I'm not running," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "I'm trying to fix my life. To fix the mess we made." He scoffed, his expression hard. "You can't fix it by pretending it didn't happen." I glared at him, my hands clenched into fists. "What do you want from me, Victor? Do you want me to throw away everything? My job? My fiance? My whole damn life?" "No," he said, his voice softening. "I just want you to be honest. With me. With yourself." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I could bury this, that I could go back to the life I'd built with Daniel. But deep down I knew the truth. There was no going back. I couldn't shake Victor's words. They followed me everywhere. Into my dreams, my conversations with Daniel, and every quiet moment I tried to find solace in. The truth I'd been running from, the one Victor had thrown in my face, felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I wasn't being honest. Not with him. Not with Daniel. Not with myself. It all came to a head one rainy Thursday night. Daniel and I were having dinner at home, a quiet meal he'd prepared himself. He was always the better cook, and he loved playing host even when it was just the two of us. But tonight, his usual warmth felt off. The easy rhythm of our relationship was gone, replaced by something tense and brittle. "Laura," he said suddenly, his fork resting on the edge of his plate. "Can I ask you something?" I froze, my own fork halfway to my mouth. "Of course. Are you happy?" His voice was steady, but his eyes searched mine with a vulnerability I wasn't used to seeing in him. "Why would you ask that?" I set my fork down, my hands trembling slightly. "Because you haven't seemed like yourself lately," he said. "You're distant. Distracted. And I don't know if it's me or work or something else, but I need to know. Are you happy?" The weight of his question settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I opened my mouth to lie, to tell him I was fine, that everything was fine. But the words wouldn't come. I don't know, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. He nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. That's an honest answer, he said quietly. I appreciate that. I wanted to reach for him, to take his hand and tell him I was sorry, but I couldn't move. The space between us felt insurmountable. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of Victor's apartment. I didn't remember deciding to go there. My car had driven itself, as if on autopilot, to the one place I knew I shouldn't be. The rain soaked through my coat as I hesitated on the sidewalk, staring up at the dimly lit windows. What was I doing here? Before I could talk myself out of it, the door opened and there he was. Victor stood in the doorway, his tie loose and his shirt untucked, his dark eyes narrowing when he saw me. Laura, he said, his voice a mix of surprise and concern. What are you? I can't do this anymore, I blurted out, my words tumbling over each other. I can't keep lying. To you. To Daniel. To myself. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. I hesitated, but the rain was relentless, and the warmth of his apartment was too tempting to ignore. Inside, the space was small and sparsely furnished, but it suited him. No frills. Just function. Victor poured us both a drink, handing me a glass of whiskey as I stood awkwardly in the middle of the room. Talk to me, he said, his voice low and steady. What's going on? I don't know who I am anymore, I admitted, my voice trembling. I'm trying to hold on to something that feels like it's slipping away, and I'm hurting everyone in the process. He nodded, taking a sip of his drink. Sometimes holding on does more damage than letting go. I looked at him, my chest tightening. Is that what you think I should do? Let go. I think you need to figure out what you want, he said, setting his glass down. Not what's expected of you. Not what's easy. What you really want. And what if I don't know what that is? His eyes softened and he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Then stop running and face it. Whatever it is. The lines between right and wrong blurred further that night. I stayed longer than I should have, talked more than I meant to. Victor listened without judgment, his presence grounding me in a way I didn't fully understand. When I finally left, the rain had stopped, but the storm inside me raged on. At home, Daniel was sitting on the couch, his laptop open on the coffee table. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. You're late, he said simply. Yeah, I said, setting my bag down. I'm sorry. The case ran longer than expected. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned back to his screen. I understand, but the way he said it made my stomach twist. He didn't sound angry, or even suspicious. He sounded resigned. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. At work, Victor and I avoided each other as much as possible, but the tension between us was palpable. Every glance, every word, carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. At home, Daniel continued to plan the wedding, but his enthusiasm was muted. He was careful around me, as if he sensed that something fragile had cracked between us. And through it all, I felt like I was drowning, caught between two lives that couldn't coexist. One night, Daniel found me sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the engagement ring on my finger. He sat beside me, his hand resting lightly on my knee. Laura, he said softly, if there's something you need to tell me, now's the time. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of his words threatening to crush me. I wanted to tell him everything. About Victor. About the lies. About the woman I'd become, someone I barely recognized. But I couldn't. I love you, I said instead, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. I love you too. He kissed my forehead, lingering for a moment before leaving the room. And as I sat there alone, I knew the truth. This was all going to fall apart. It was just a matter of time. I had always thought of guilt as something you could live with, like a scar. Ugly but manageable. But now it was a living, breathing thing clawing at me day and night. Every moment with Daniel felt heavier, every glance from Victor more damning. I was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and I could feel the rope fraying beneath my feet. The precinct was quiet the next morning, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the air. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the stack of paperwork in front of me. My mind was elsewhere, tangled in the mess I'd created. The sound of footsteps broke my reverie, and I looked up to see Victor approaching. "We caught a lead," he said, his voice clipped. "Robbery case. Witness spotted the suspect near Logan Square." I nodded, grabbing my coat. "Let's go." The drive was silent, tension filling the small space of the car. Victor kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. I wanted to say something to break the suffocating quiet, but the words wouldn't come. When we arrived at the scene, the suspect was already gone. A dead end like so many others. Victor cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair as he surveyed the empty alley. "We're missing something," he muttered, his frustration palpable. "We'll find him," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Victor turned to me, his dark eyes searching mine. "Will we? Or are we just pretending we can fix this like everything else?" The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just talking about the case. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Let's get back to the precinct," I said quietly, walking toward the car. Victor didn't follow immediately. When he finally got in, he didn't speak. The silence between us was heavier than ever. That night, Daniel surprised me with dinner reservations at an upscale restaurant downtown. He wore the suit I'd chosen for him, his smile warm and hopeful. I tried to match his enthusiasm, but it felt like I was playing a role, the real me buried beneath layers of guilt and shame. "This is nice," Daniel said, raising his glass of wine. "We haven't done this in a while." "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "It is." He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Laura, are we okay?" The question hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on me. I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Of course," I said finally, the lie slipping out before I could stop it. Daniel nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "I love you, you know that, right?" "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I love you too." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the image of Victor. His dark eyes, the way he looked at me like he could see everything I was trying to hide. The breaking point came 2 days later. Victor and I were reviewing surveillance footage in one of the precinct's conference rooms. It was late, the rest of the team long gone. The glow of the monitor cast shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "This guy's a ghost," Victor muttered, leaning back in his chair. "He knows how to disappear." "We'll find him," I said, my voice automatic. Victor turned to me, his gaze piercing. "Do you believe that? Or are you just saying it because it's easier than admitting we're lost?" I stiffened, his words cutting deeper than they should have. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means you're lying," he said, his voice low but steady. "To me. To Daniel. To yourself. And it's eating you alive." I stood, my hands clenched into fists. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he said, standing as well, his towering presence forcing me to step back. "You think I can't see what this is doing to you? You think I don't know what it feels like to carry something you can't fix?" "I'm trying," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I'm trying to hold it together, but my words faltered, tears stinging my eyes. I don't know how." Victor's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "Then stop pretending you have to." Before I could stop him, his hand was on my cheek, his touch warm and steady. "Laura," he said softly, his voice filled with something I couldn't name. "You don't have to do this alone." For a moment I let myself lean into him, the weight of the world slipping away. But reality crashed back in and I pulled away, my chest heaving. "This has to stop," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to stop." Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "If that's what you want." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just grabbed my coat and walked out, leaving him standing alone in the dim light of the conference room. When I got home, Daniel was waiting for me in the kitchen. His tie was loosened, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his eyes tired but filled with something I couldn't quite place. "You're late," he said, his voice neutral. "Yeah," I said, setting my bag down. "Case ran long." He nodded, taking a sip of his drink. I figured. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting, searching. "Daniel," I began, but he cut me off. "Are you going to tell me the truth? he asked, his voice calm but firm. Or am I supposed to keep pretending I don't know? My heart stopped, the weight of his words crashing down on me. He knew. He'd known all along. Daniel's words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. My heart was pounding and my pulse roared in my ears. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there, watching me with an expression I couldn't read, calm, patient but hollow. How long have you known? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Long enough, he replied, setting his glass down on the counter with deliberate precision. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, that maybe I was overthinking. But I'm not stupid, Laura. You've been different for months. I looked away, the shame pressing down on me like a crushing weight. Daniel, Who is it? He interrupted, his tone sharp. Don't lie to me. I need the truth. I hesitated, my chest tightening as I tried to summon the courage to speak. Victor, I said finally, my voice trembling. It's Victor Reyes. His expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Victor, he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. The new detective. The one you've been spending all those late nights with. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen, Daniel. I didn't mean for it to. Don't, he said sharply, holding up a hand to stop me. Don't give me excuses. I don't want to hear about what you meant or didn't mean. Just tell me the truth. Do you love him? The question hit me like a slap. Did I love Victor? I didn't know. What I felt for him was raw and chaotic, something I couldn't define. But love? That word didn't fit the storm inside me. No, I said, my voice breaking. I don't love him. Daniel exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as if to steady himself. Then why? He asked, his voice quieter now, but no less devastating. Why would you do this to us? I don't know, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I was lost and he was there. I don't have an excuse, Daniel. I wish I did, but I don't. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. I gave you everything, Laura. I trusted you. I believed in us. I know, I whispered. And I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve anything. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was deafening. The weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. Finally, Daniel straightened, his face hardening into a mask of resolve. You need to leave, he said, his voice cold and final. Pack a bag and go. I stared at him, my heart shattering. Daniel, please. Go, he repeated, his voice rising. I can't look at you right now. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I packed a bag in silence, the sound of the zipper echoing in the quiet house. Daniel didn't follow me, didn't say another word. When I walked out the door, I felt the finality of it like a blade in my chest. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring through my tears. I couldn't go to Victor. That would only make everything worse. So I found myself in a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the walls were paper thin, but it didn't matter. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and let the numbness take over. The next day I went to work. I couldn't afford to stay away. The cases didn't stop just because my life was in shambles. When I walked into the precinct, Victor was waiting for me near my desk. He looked tense, his dark eyes scanning my face. You look like hell, he said, his voice low. Thanks, I muttered, dropping my bag on the floor. I'll add that to my growing list of problems. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. What happened? Daniel knows, I said simply, not looking at him. Victor's jaw tightened. And he kicked me out, I replied, shrugging as if it didn't hurt as much as it did. So congratulations. I'm officially a disaster. Laura, he began, but I cut him off. Don't, I said, my voice sharp. Don't try to make this better. You can't. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he said finally. You know that, right? I know, I said, my voice softening. But it did. The next few days were a blur of routine and avoidance. I threw myself into work, chasing leads and burying myself in paperwork, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. Victor kept his distance, which I was grateful for. But his presence was still a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. Daniel, on the other hand, was a ghost. I didn't expect him to call, but the silence was deafening. I destroyed the best thing in my life and there was no going back. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came one night at the precinct. Victor and I were alone, reviewing evidence in the conference room. The tension between us was unbearable. The air thick with everything we weren't saying. "I can't keep doing this," I said, suddenly breaking the silence. "Doing what?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with something darker. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Whatever this is. It's toxic, Victor. It's destroying everything." "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice rising. "You think I don't hate myself for dragging you into this?" "You didn't drag me into anything," I snapped. "I made my choices, and they were wrong." "Then why do you keep coming back?" he demanded, stepping closer. "Why can't you walk away?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was I didn't know how to walk away. Not from Victor. Not from the mess I'd created. But I had to try. "This has to end," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to end." Victor's expression hardened, but he nodded. "If that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "It's about what's right." He didn't argue. He just watched me, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't name. And as I walked out of the room, I felt the weight of finality settle over me. But deep down I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The days dragged on in a haze, each one bleeding into the next. I functioned on autopilot, showing up to work, going through the motions, and avoiding anything that forced me to confront the mess I'd made. But the weight of my choices was suffocating. I could feel it pressing down on me, heavier with each passing moment. Daniel hadn't reached out. I hadn't expected him to, but the silence still cut deep. The apartment we'd shared, the life we'd built, it was all gone. I stayed in the motel. The smell of mildew and cheap cleaning supplies a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. Victor, for his part, kept his distance. I caught glimpses of him in the precinct, his jaw tight, his movements brisk. When we did have to speak, it was brief and professional, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. It wasn't until the phone call came that everything truly fell apart. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting on the edge of the motel bed, staring blankly at the muted television. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering. "Detective Jameson," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "Detective," a man's voice replied, sharp and clipped. "This is Warden Grayson from the state penitentiary. I believe you're acquainted with one of our inmates, Luis Reyes, Victor's father." The name sent a jolt through me, the weight of it settling in my chest. "Yes," I said cautiously. "What's this about?" "He's asked to see you," Grayson said simply. "Says it's urgent." I frowned, my mind racing. "Why me?" "You'll have to ask him that," the warden replied. "But if you're coming, I suggest you do it soon. He's not in good shape." The next morning I stood outside the penitentiary, the cold wind cutting through my coat. I hadn't told Victor where I was going. I wasn't sure if I could face him yet, let alone explain why his father had reached out to me. The guards led me through the sterile corridors, their boots echoing off the concrete floors. When we reached the visitor's room, Luis Reyes was already there, shackled to the table. He was older than I'd expected, his face lined with age and regret. His eyes, however, were sharp, a flicker of something defiant still burning within them. "You're Laura Jameson," he said as I sat across from him. His voice was gravelly, worn from years behind bars. "That's right," I said, studying him carefully. "What do you want?" He leaned back, his gaze never leaving mine. "You're working with my son." "Yes." "Then you know what he's like," he said, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "Always trying to fix what's broken. Always chasing ghosts." I clenched my jaw, unsure where this was going. "If you have something to say, Mr. Reyes, I suggest you get to it." He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Straight to the point. I like that." He leaned forward, his shackles clinking against the table. "I know you've been seeing him. I know what's been happening between you." The air left my lungs. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because he's my son," Luis said simply. "And I know him better than he knows himself." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. "He's a good man," Luis continued, his voice softer now. Better than I ever was. But he's carrying a weight he doesn't understand. And so are you. I swallowed hard, the knot in my throat tightening. What are you trying to say? He sighed, his shoulders sagging. I killed Daniel Calloway's parents, he said, his voice flat. I took their lives. But it wasn't random. My blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? They weren't saints, he said, his gaze piercing. They weren't the people Daniel thinks they were. And Victor? He doesn't know the truth either. I shook my head, my mind reeling. You're lying. Am I? Luis said, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Or is the world just more complicated than you want to believe? I stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not going to be part of it. Ask Victor, Luis called after me as I walked to the door. Ask him what he remembers. You'll see I'm telling the truth. I didn't go back to the precinct that day. I drove aimlessly, Luis's words echoing in my mind. Was it possible? Could Daniel's parents have been more than what he believed? And if they were, what did that mean for everything he'd built in their memory? When I finally made it back to the motel, my phone buzzed with a text from Victor. We need to talk. Now. Victor was waiting for me outside the motel, his expression grim. I hadn't seen him like this before. Angry but also wounded. He didn't say anything as I approached, his jaw tightening as he watched me. Did you see him? He asked finally, his voice low. Yes, I said, my chest tightening. He wanted to talk about your past. About Daniel's parents. Victor's eyes darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. And you believed him? I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. But he said I should ask you. So I'm asking. Victor exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I was a kid, he said finally, his voice breaking. I didn't know everything that was happening. But I remember things. Things that didn't make sense back then. Like what? I pressed. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. Like the money. The visits from people in suits. My father said it was all part of a deal, but I didn't know what that meant. My stomach turned. Victor, if your father is telling the truth, if Daniel's parents were involved in something, this changes everything. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it doesn't change what I did. What we did. I looked at him, my chest tightening. Victor, don't, he said, cutting me off. We can't fix this, Laura. We can't fix any of it. The finality in his voice was like a blade. And for the first time I realized he was right.